You're listening to the ESO Network, your station for all things geek.
Hello, music lovers. This is Modern Musicology. My name is Alan, and let me say hello to Stephanie Seymour.
Hey, people.
And Rob Levy.
Hey, how are you?
And we are joined by a very special guest today. We have Mr. Alan J. Porter, who is the author of a book called Before They Were Beatles and the host of a podcast of the same name. Mr. Porter, how are you this afternoon? Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. And yes, I'm good this afternoon. I have not long just finished listening to my first listen through of the Red and the Blue album. So,
yay.
Yeah. So,
Excellent.
Looking forward to talking about it.
Excellent. So, can you tell us a little bit about your Beatles journey? Like, where did it begin? And can you tell us what led up to the book and the podcast that you've done? Because these are filled with minutia. There is a lot of detail. There's a lot of background information in these things. And I'm curious to know what got you to the point of wanting to write a book and do a podcast. Where did the idea for this come from?
Wow. How long have we got for the show? So as you can probably tell from the accent, even though I live in Texas, I'm not exactly from around these here parts originally. So born and raised on the banks of the River Mersey, but not in Liverpool, further upstream, just outside of Manchester. First encountered the Beatles when I was 4 years old, when they were on a local news channel, just as they were breaking. So October 63.
Wow.
Was my first, and sort of grew up listening to the Beatles. And then when I was in my teens in the 70s, when I started buying records, obviously started buying a lot of Beatles records. By the time I got to college, I was actually going to college in Liverpool. And as you do when you're at college, you sort of end up in a lot of bars in the evenings in and around Liverpool. And of course, every bar and going to listen to bands in little clubs in and around Liverpool, every club you're in, somebody had a Beatles story about how they helped discover the Beatles. The number of people I met in Liverpool who helped discover the Beatles was immense. It was like there was at least one guy in every bar who helped discover the Beatles.
Oh, I'm sure there was.
Or was going to be the drummer instead of Ringo. Or everybody had a Beatles story. And that sort of stuck in my mind. And then many years later, I sort of got to know through email Rod Davis of the Quarrymen, who was the banjo player in the Quarrymen, and we had exchanged a few emails. And I thought, there's some interesting stuff he's telling me here. And then I was traveling a lot for work, and after many evenings of sitting in a hotel room, there's only so many crappy TV shows you can watch, and I'm like, what am I going to do while I'm on the road? And I just started writing the book. I thought I wanted to try and get to the bottom of all these different stories I'd heard either when I was in Liverpool or over the years. And at that point, nobody had really done a book focused on those. When I was trying to sell the book, everybody was like, nobody's interested in the Beatles before they were on Ed Sullivan. So I ended up, 20 years ago now, writing the book Before They Were Beatles and self-published it. And it has been a good, strong, steady seller, still sells 20 plus years on.
Wow.
But of course, with any book like that, as soon as you publish it, you find out bits of it are wrong. So including Rod Davis literally emailing me the day after it came out and said, that photograph we thought was taken on this date, we were all wrong, it was taken on this other date.
Oh, wow.
Thanks. So yeah, it's just sort of been ticking in the background, and I've been thinking about doing a expanded, updated version for a while, and I thought, well, I wonder if anybody would be actually interested in that. And I thought a good way to test that was to put the podcast, to do a podcast about it. And so the book stops with them going to Hamburg. The book really covers them from teenagers, the formation of the band, and them going to Hamburg. So with the podcast, we did the book and extended on the existing book, but then we also carried the story on into the Hamburg and Cavern years, up to Ringo joining the band, and them actually up to the end of 1962. Because a lot of folks, when they'd read the book, they were like, this is great, but what about Ringo? So I wanted to bring his story in and bring it up to. So that's what we've done. And I'm actually working on that expanded, updated version of the book now. And I have a monthly newsletter. So if you subscribe to beforebeatles.substack.com, you can take the journey along with us as we write and expand and update the book, because I'm doing monthly updates and extracts in the newsletter as well. So, and the podcast just took off much more than I expected it to. And in January, we're actually going to launch a new series. We've actually on the podcast now done the story all the way through to December 62. So we've told the story of them before they were Beatles. And in January next year, we're launching a new series called The Forgotten Beatles, where we're going to take a deeper dive of the other people who were seemingly peripheral to the story. You know, the well-known ones like Pete Best and Stuart Sutcliffe, and that we'll cover, but we're also going to cover people like Chas Newby, who played 4 gigs for them and bass when he was home from college for his Christmas holidays, and ended up playing 4 gigs with the Beatles.
Wow.
So we're gonna dig into people like that as well. So
that sounds really interesting. And so if all of this stuff is successful, then of course that leads into the third thing, which is After They Were Beatles, where you cover the solo careers of all the guys. So, and
I think that's been done.
That'll keep you busy forever.
Well, this has already been 20 years of Beatles stuff. So another good 20 years out the next round, I think will be good.
There you go.
Yeah.
All right. So we are recording this episode on November 12th. 2 days ago, we got the brand new editions of the Beatles Red and Blue collections. And that is a collection that was originally released in April of 1973. It's a double set. The first half, of course, as everybody knows, the red one covers 1962 to 1966. The blue one, the second one, covers 1967 to 1970. And we have these brand new editions of them, expanded, remixed, and remastered by Giles Martin. And it's been a really interesting experience listening to all this stuff. So, Mr. Porter, what can you tell us about the origins of these albums in 1973? As
I mentioned earlier, I sort of grew up listening to the Beatles in the 60s, but by the time I started buying records for myself, the Beatles had broken out. So 73, when these came out, was very much among my first record purchases for myself, and probably the most played albums that I got. And to an extent, even though I'd grown up the Beatles, they were sort of background to my life. It was these 2 albums that really turned me into a big Beatles fan. And I think I've been reading a lot over the last week or couple of days as people have been getting these albums about how this was their introduction to the Beatles, either during the 70s or with later reissue, later on, that this is really what opened their minds and ears to the whole of the Beatles catalogue. And I think that's the progression. I think that's always been one of the strengths of this 2 albums is that chronological journey that you take with them. And obviously, 62 to 66 and then 67 to, 70. 70, yeah. They're a good. It's a good division point, if you like, between the touring Beatles and the studio Beatles, and the way it worked there. So, unfortunately, I sort of lost mine when we moved over to the US and we were cutting down on weight to ship over. You don't want to be paying for too much. So all my vinyl was sold off because we all had CDs by then, and nobody had vinyl. Nobody had turntables in the mid 90s.
Right.
It was all CD. So I lost mine. So I was really excited to get these new versions. But I've had quite a lot of friends and folks on Facebook and say, "Oh, I've still got my vinyl, my original vinyls, and and I still listen to them. And these were my gateway drug to the Beatles." So
I think these albums were also, because these were the record company response to like sort of bootleg stuff that was put out, and then they decided to put these albums out so that there would be an official compilation in a way.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
And, even in its original form, I mean, they've been expanded considerably in this new edition with 21 additional tracks. But even in the original version of them, they were pretty comprehensive. I mean, it really covers a lot of stuff from those 2 respective time periods as far as getting to know the Beatles catalog and their stylistic changes and the way that they evolved over that 10-year period. I mean, it's just one of the greatest. I mean, when you call it a greatest hits collection, it really is a killer collection of material that gives you a good view into what was happening with that band. And I don't think it could be bettered.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about these new editions.
Yeah.
What was your first reaction to them when you first got them and started listening to them? What really struck you about these?
I'm not a remix it's fine to me, and I think it's great that a lot of albums lately have been, remixed and you can hear things better. And I don't tend to go bananas over stuff like that. But when I put my headphones on to listen to these new mixes, I really was kind of blown away by just hearing a modern sounding mix that just brought out so many things that you really couldn't hear so well before, especially as Rob and I were talking about. Obviously, Ringo, Rob, you were saying Ringo really is a beneficiary of this in many ways. But I also heard so much of the percussion that was a lot of times in the background. You just couldn't fully hear, but also just hearing the mix of their voices and the mix of the music, everything. I think to me, it sounded, I really love most of the things. There's definitely tracks that I think they didn't do well on. I Am the Walrus being one of them, but God, man, when I heard Magical Mystery Tour, that is my favorite one of the mixes. I was pretty much like, I've played that like 20 times already.
Yeah, I was pretty much straight into it, like 5:30 a.m. Friday when I got up. Like, oh, time to wake up, time for the Beatles, which was kind of annoying to other people I live with. But it wasn't really till I got to Hard Day's Night that I really heard a lot of stuff. I mean, I'd heard Love Me Do before, and I was like, okay, I get it. But Hard Day's Night, to me, it's like you could just hear Ringo bashing the holy daylights out of those drums. And this is going to lead to a conversation Steph and I had a little earlier about this, but that was sort of the first time I'm like, okay. I mean, before it sounded clearer, but they sounded still familiar. Hard Day's Night was kind of the launch point for me. Like, okay, this is different. And it might have been the ear has to get used to it.
Yeah.
For me, the whole experience is weird because it's almost like finding out you have a child you didn't know you had or something, because you've heard these recordings so long in your memory. And we are all of a generation where we don't even have to put the music on to know what these sound like. We hear them in our head. Like if Alan just said Help by the Beatles, we just hear it.
Yeah, true.
And now we have to reprogram our brain to hear it in this new way as opposed to the old way. So it's kind of an interesting rewiring of what we know as a cultural thing. I was really impressed by how clear everything was. There's a lot of stuff that came out, and I've been wrestling with this, as a lot of other people have too, is that, we'll get to this in some of the other songs later, but like some of the songs, I'm like, is that supposed to be clean? Is it supposed to be pristine sounding? I'll talk about this a little later when we get into actual songs.
Yeah.
But so there's some of that, but I was just really amazed at just the clarity of it and some of the stuff that got brought out. There's some of the Harrison guitars that I hear a little clearer, and a lot of the Ringo drumming. So for me, it was like just kind of this weird, jarring, sensual experience as well as a cultural one.
Yeah, I would say that was, for me, was just the clarity of it. There was several times when I was just listening to it, and I said to my wife, I hadn't heard that bit. I hadn't heard that before.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And, again, some of it was just background stuff.
Mm-hmm.
The chorus of voices at the beginning of Sgt. Pepper, I'd never really heard before. Some of the stuff at the end of the tracks as they're fading out, little snatches of even sounded like studio conversation or whatever, just going in there. But yes, the drumming, I'm a huge flag waver for Ringo. So I think these mixes really show what a very innovative drummer he was. I think that really helps with that. And also some of Paul's bass lines coming across a lot cleaner.
Oh, yeah.
I agree.
Clearer. Yeah.
That was one of the things that really struck me. So to back up a little bit, most everything from the Blue album, the second volume, comes from Giles Martin's recent remixes and remasters of the 50th anniversary editions of those particular albums, Abbey Road and all of those. The red edition, though, has that from Revolver, but most everything before that, these are brand new stereo mixes. And Giles has said in the press that first of all, they weren't planning on doing the earlier albums because he didn't think that it would even be possible to get these kind of mixes from that earlier stuff, from those recordings. And he was very, very surprised at the way that these early singles were just made to sound so much newer. And I don't remember, was it Paste? It was one of the magazines said that these new mixes made it sound like these recordings could have come from up and coming garage band like a week ago. Like they sound that new and that fresh. One of the things that really stood out to me is that everything seems very balanced. Like the guitars versus the bass, you're talking about the bass parts coming through. There's a lot of them that to me sound like everything gels in a whole new way. And this is mainly from the Red album. Everything has a very clean and very new and modern, as Stephanie was saying, very modern sound. And Giles was also talking about how the biggest surprise for all of them when it was done was getting a whole new drum sound basically from Ringo and being able to hear him in those mixes in a way that was never possible before. And I think it's remarkable.
Yeah, he surprised himself. I was reading a similar, maybe the same article, but he was just didn't think that it could even be possible to get those results, and they did with that the new technology.
Which, I guess that means that now we'll be seeing reissues of the first set of albums, complete albums. That's not
Hopefully.
a bad thing.
Hopefully. Yeah. I mean, to me, when they announced these, after hearing Now and Then, which I'm sure we'll talk about later.
Yeah.
That made me really excited for this Red album, knowing that they were taking that same sort of technology and applying it to these early hits. So, like the Blue album, great. It'd be nice to have another version, replace my old version of maybe a few extra tracks. Yeah, that's fine. But yeah, for me, it was all about getting the Red album and listening to these remasters of the early hits that really made me hit the buy now button on the Beatles website.
Same for me too, because I'd heard most all of there was a few ones on the Blue set that are new. The ones from Magical Mystery Tour, a couple of non-album singles, these are new stereo mixes for those. But like the first 3/4 of the Red album is all brand new, and it's so good.
And just, I love all Beatles songs, but I'm really more of a latter catalog Beatles fan.
Yeah.
And when I heard these earlier songs, it really made me more into them. So I do hope that they remix, that they do full albums for all of these. I think it would be really interesting.
Right.
But because you're right, like, I think, Rob, did you say Hard Day's Night was the one that was...
Yeah, there's a couple of these early ones. I mean, should I just jump into this now, I guess?
Sure.
Or no?
Yeah.
So Hard Day's Night was interesting to me because I could hear the drums in a different way than I thought. I even think Ringo used at one point a bit of a brush on those than sticks, or at least it sounds like it. And I was just like, wow, I can hear the drums and it doesn't sound like it's at the back of the room. Mm-hmm. Then I get to Twist and Shout.
I know, I was listening to that today.
This is one of the things that is a weird part for me, right? Is that when I hear Twist and Shout, before all this came out, before I heard Twist and Shout, I hear with the rawness of his voice and sort of the ramshackle musical instruments behind it, I hear the very early sort of, you could draw a lineage from Twist and Shout to punk, because it's from rock. It's almost like from rockabilly to punk, or rockabilly to rock to punk, because it's very sort of ramshackled. It's bands that don't necessarily master their instruments yet, things like that. And then you've got John's voice, which is just raw. It sounds like he literally is singing with a sore throat, or that he's like being stabbed while he's singing. I don't know what it is, right?
I doubt that's it.
It just sounds absolutely raw. Now, cleaned up, it sounded faster, and some of this is all in your mind too, right? I know that.
Yes, your mind does rework these.
It sounded faster, and it just sounded like polished, and I'm not sure that song's supposed to be polished. Roll Over Beethoven, I'm not sure that's supposed to be polished.
I am with you 100%. Like I said, I was really excited for the Red album. The tracks that disappointed me were the cover versions.
The covers.
I'm maybe because my interest is the very early Beatles, and the Hamburg and Cavern days, and I've listened to a lot of those tapes. I also co-manage a Beatles tribute band that focuses on the Cavern and Hamburg days. So I'm used to listening to those tracks, as Rob says, in a very raw state.
Mm-hmm.
For me, you're right. The Beatles were the proto-punks. The Hamburg Cavern era Beatles, before they got in the studio, you can draw a direct line from them to the punk. Twist and Shout in particular is John's Hamburg voice. I mean, that's what he called it. I mean, because, he screwed his voice singing for 8 hours and shouting on stage in Hamburg in smoke-filled rooms. And Twist and Shout is a great example of his Hamburg voice. So yes, I was really looking forward to hearing those. I was like, oh, great, they're going to do some of the really early stuff. And when I heard them, I'm with you, Rob. I'm like, nope, too polished. It didn't catch me at all. So.
I mean, I liked it. Don't get me wrong. I
liked them, but they're not the right versions of those songs for me anyway. But I've got an inherent bias to the raw stuff. So.
But I also made a correlation that I never had made before between Twist and Shout and Revolution later, in that you almost see that sort of rough and ready, rough and tumble band back on Revolution. And it's almost like with Revolution, they're trying to sort of tap into the Hamburg sound to stay together. That's probably me reaching. But like, I Want to Hold Your Hand sounds great.
Yes.
I was just going to say that. Yes.
So what is it about the ones that work versus the ones that don't? That's I guess that's the $1 million question.
But I think that's subjective. I mean, I really do, because like like just saying before, like I Am the Walrus, that didn't do it for me. It just sounds too different and weird to me. But then again, there's, Magical Mystery Tour, which I could listen to all day long. I think it's a subjective thing too, of how your brain is wired to hear things. And
like to me, the first 30 seconds of Here Comes the Sun, I'm like, wow, that guitar sounds amazingly better than it ever did. And I love it. And then I'm like, but the rest of the song sounds the same. There's little bits and pieces, right? No, it's just little bits and pieces, right?
And I kind of felt the same way about the guitar intro to Beethoven.
Yes.
It felt crisper. It felt like a lot more precise than I'd ever heard it before.
And, the thing about Roll Over Beethoven is that when a band says, hey, I'm going to play Roll Over Beethoven, it's kind of like when you do Rock Around the Clock. You don't want it to sound pretty. It's supposed to sound like dirty and early and
what
grungy.
Ira was saying last week, remember?
Yeah.
Ira was saying the same thing.
Those records are like messy on purpose.
Yeah.
Roll Over Beethoven seemed really flat to me.
Yes. That's a good way of putting it. Yeah.
Interesting.
I was reading a few articles, and they're talking about hearing things differently. There actually may be a few different things that, like Alan, you were saying that they've brought up at the end of the mixes or even in the beginning, because there was someone that was mentioning the opening lines of Can't Buy Me Love and like what happened to the first lines where Paul sings, Can't buy me love. And instead of singing the lilt in love, you just hear Can't buy me love, like a straight love. Because I think my theory is they're mixing. There's a double on that song, right? He's double vocals. Yeah, they brought up the one that probably didn't have as much of a lilt. You can still hear a double vocal on those 3 lines, but it doesn't. You can't really hear the full double, I think, until he starts really singing the whole song. So there might be things like that really are different because they're mixing, they're mixing it differently.
That's so interesting, because I didn't notice that.
I beat him like 17 times. I was like, yes, he's right. Yeah. There's a lilt.
Speaking of that, when these first came out, so this was Friday, and I was planning on Friday, I was going to go and buy the CDs. But as soon as they were available on Spotify, I pulled them up, and I was on my desktop, and I don't have the best speakers on my computer. They're fine, but they're not like, great quality. But I was doing that, and I was sort of listening through a little bit, and then I just found a track here or there, and I just compared. I pulled from the original album. I pulled from the #1 collection. I pulled from Anthology. I did, and I just listened to the different ways. And even on my substandard desktop speakers, the new mixes sound remarkably different, but I hadn't noticed any change like that. I mean, that's like a minutia that I hadn't quite got to yet, but I can't wait to go and listen to that.
Like who knows every single note of every song. And I mean, I would know that on maybe like a Crowded House song, but not on Beatles. I love the Beatles, but I'm not like a fanatic like that. Yeah. On the early stuff, I should say, on the earlier stuff.
Yeah. Since we just mentioned cover versions, one of the things I want to talk about in the Red Collection is that with all these expanded tracks, the original release, there was two things that it overlooked intentionally. One of them was any contribution, vocally or songwriting, by George. And the other one was any success that they had in their early releases with covers. Everything on the Red Collection originally was all Lennon and McCartney songs. And you totally missed out on those two aspects, very important aspects, I think, of the overview of the Beatles' career. And that's one of the things that this new release corrects. We've got some George, not as many as I would like. We've got some George songs on the Red Collection, and we have representation of their biggest hits of cover songs. So I think it's a much more well-rounded collection than it was originally.
Right. I mean, I think the reason there was no cover songs on the original one probably just came down to financial.
Oh, I'm sure it did.
Of licensing. I'm sure that was the main thing. Yeah.
It's also easier now to deal with the Chuck Berry estate with his kids and his family than it was with Chuck Berry himself. Just in terms of rights and money, because the amount of money Chuck Berry wanted versus the amount of money that his kids want with time, times have changed, right? So I think that's part of it too. I also think too that part of this is that Harrison really thought his record should be left in the context of the albums and not lifted and separated and thrown in with other things. So I think that I read that somewhere that was part of the original reason why the albums were that way. Because he was really finicky about track order and placement and things. And when you read the history of the Beatles, and Alan, you might know more about this than me, but Harrison was the one that was really particular about where the album tracks were and how everything flowed. And I think he did a lot of sort of the final tracking with Martin, if I'm right. I might be wrong on that, but I thought
I think you're right. He was more thinking Sgt. Pepper aside, I think, which was McCartney's thing beginning to end, but George was very, as you say, sort of had more of the artistic vision of how the album should flow. As the rest of it was this song good enough to be on the album? Yes, no, but where it actually appeared on the album, I don't think they were that particularly bothered about. George was, I think, more particular about that. So,
Well, if that's the case, and he wasn't bothered by not having a song included on Red, he missed out on a lot of royalties.
I don't know. I wouldn't go so far as to say he wasn't bothered about it.
Well, I'm sure he was bothered, but
Yeah.
I'm sure his film company did quite well, and he's probably fine.
Still. But to me, I'm just a George boy, and I am always kind of like protective about the George identity within the band. And I'm happy that he's now included in the Red Collection and that we have a little bit more from him on the Blue set as well.
Yeah, I mean, just going back to the business side, we said about these albums were released to stop the bootlegs and everything else that was coming around from the record company. And we sort of just touched on, the reason probably there wasn't the covers on there was the money side. I also wonder if that's partly why George's stuff wasn't on there, because it was sort of driven very much by Northern Songs, and the company that owned the rights to the actual songs would probably make a lot more from a pure Lennon and McCartney collection. So
could be.
The other thing too is I haven't seen the physical copy yet because I'm desperate living in squalor and I haven't gotten the physicals yet. But is there a booklet or what's the liner stuff look like for this?
I don't know about the CDs where I have the vinyl, and in each vinyl there's like a 2-sided sheet with
I've seen that.
essay. Yeah,
there's a little booklet in the CD.
Okay, cool. That's kind of what because I'm still a big fan of booklets and information on things. I'm still a big fan of that. The other thing too that this set kind of does that kind of mildly irritates me a little bit is one of the things I loved about Blue and Red was the cover art. And the cover art for it is very much red. It's like, okay, I can know where this era of the Beatles is. Blue is the same. But I love this idea of returning to the same point in sort of time and space with the band in two different times and things. And I think that you could look at it easily and go, okay, this is early Beatles. This is late Beatles. I get it. Now it doesn't look like there's that much of a separation. It looks like they're just kind of mushed together. If the artwork that I'm looking at is right.
No, they're exactly the same as the original covers.
But I thought like there's every picture I see, they're like next to each other, right? Kind of.
No.
Yeah,
I've seen like a long box. Like this, what I've seen is like
they are on the cover of the slipcase.
Yeah, that's what I've seen is the slipcase.
But the actual album covers are exactly the same as the original.
Right. I've only seen the slipcase, right? And I was concerned that they were damaging that because I like having the individual art on each individual section. I think that's fantastic.
It's been the same, exactly the same on every reissue.
Yeah, so, and that's part of what bugged me. Is like, why is this different? So I know I'm being the old finicky guy in the room.
Actually, you're not, because I've heard a few people online and say, why didn't they take the opportunity to redesign the art covers like they did with Hollywood Bowl when it came out as 8 days a week and stuff? And I was like, oh God, no! These are so iconic. They are. For a generation like us, where these two albums were our gateway drug to the Beatles, it's like, no, don't change them. They mean so much to so many people.
Oh, exactly. They're so recognizable. There is no way you can change it. But what if they just used the same cover photos but swapped the colors? Totally kidding. That would throw everybody for a loop.
Well, I was going to give it a sort of talk about a more overall arching thing, which I already talked to Alan and Rob about a little bit. But, when I talked to my mother about this topic of the podcast this week, she's a huge music fan. She's 81. She grew up with the Beatles and loves the Beatles. And actually, the reason I even know who the Beatles are is because my parents used to play the Beatles all the time in the house. So one of the first, when I explained what they were doing with the Atmos remixes and everything, she had her first comment to me, which I thought was really interesting from my 81-year-old mom, was, what do you think about this changing the art in a way of, changing the way, like the Beatles had this technology when, had their own technology when they were making these records. This is what they put out then. And this is what, they felt represented them. And there's many different answers for this or sides that you can pick on this. And I feel like there's a lot of discussion about this online, but I think that, from a purist point of view, you can definitely, still listen to your old mixes if you want. I personally hear these and now I want to just hear the newer mixes on most of the songs because I feel like it brings out a whole new thing. And I don't think it changes it too much for me where I'm like, I'm not listening to the Beatles, And also, I also think there's a more clinical side of the whole thing where you can just listen to them and say, wow, this is really interesting. And this is how we're hearing new things. We're hearing different aspects of it, but you can just go back to listen to your old mixes if you feel like it, know?
Yeah. I kind of feel like, even though I think your mother's exactly right, that the technology that they used at the time, they got the best that they could have from what they were using and felt that that was what represented them the best. They were also people who were not afraid of technology. And I think that if all four of them were still here, they would be as into this of, bringing their music to a whole new sound, a whole new way through a whole new technology. I think that would excite them, especially John. Yeah. John loved the studio trickery. He loved experimenting. And I think that they would have been all into this.
We also know from Now and Then that they were already that at least two of them are into it because they use that technology for that song. So I think so too. And I sort of was explaining that to her and, just.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you said about, they used the technology to its limits at the time to project who they were, but they actually went to Alan's point, they went beyond that a lot. They actually, particularly once they got into the studio phase, they came up against those limits.
Yeah.
And they invented ways to get past that. And a lot of things that are now standard recording studio stuff is because of the Beatles.
Yeah.
So yes, I think, as you said, certainly, Paul and Ringo would have had to have signed off on this anyway. They're
True.
Clearly, 50% of them are clearly in favor of it. And I think John and George would have been too, because that was part of the Beatles' DNA. That's what, we talked about, that progression that you hear throughout this album from, the start of the Red to the end of the Blue. It's like 10 years progression in the art. I think is an illustration of the fact that they would have gone along with this sort of thing. And plus they, now they're savvy businessmen. They weren't back then, but now they are. And
right.
Right.
The other thing about this, and something that you just said, this is only 10 years. I mean, the amount of, we've talked about this before and everybody has said this, but it's still just.
Well, actually, it's not even 10 years. It's 8.
It's 8 years of recording.
Mind
exactly. And the amount that they changed musically, compositionally, technologically, everything that they did changed so much in 8 years. That just blows my mind.
Yeah. When you think about the fact that, yes, it was 8-year recording career. These guys were in their early 20s.
Yeah.
And just the legacy that they've left behind, what they changed and the legacy they left behind is just incredible.
Right.
There's not many bands that another band that comes to mind that really radically changed was the Beach. What comes to my mind right away is the Beach Boys, just as a comparison or just someone who wildly improved and just got incredible, complicated sounds and complicated songs and
I would
really
say
matured.
I would say Queen and ELO also were very much pushing boundaries and expanding beyond what they had the ability to accomplish. But
yeah, I throw David Bowie in that mix as well.
Oh yeah.
But,
okay.
But the interesting thing, and I've heard this said a lot. One of the fascinating things about the Beatles is it's a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end.
Yes.
And none of the other groups we've mentioned have a really clearly defined end, other than maybe dying. But even Queen, whatever version of Queen you wanted to say, played a gig here in Austin 2 weeks ago.
Yep.
They're still out there. They're still doing stuff. The Stones' a new album out. And stuff. These stories are dragging on and on and on, sometimes in a good way, sometimes in a not so good way. But the Beatles is a very definite microcosm of time that impacted our whole culture. And I think, that makes them unique.
Agreed.
Yeah.
All right. Any specific tracks that we want to hit that surprised us in a good way or bad way?
Well, I mentioned Twist and Shout was my sort of disappointment. I'm actually going to completely disagree with Stephanie. I actually loved I Like the Walrus.
That's okay. We can agree to disagree.
Yeah, we can. I really enjoyed that mix, yes. I will say, I think it was In My Life, was when I heard In My Life. I was like, oh, yeah, I really, really get it now. Yeah.
Wow. There is some stuff on the second half, the second disc of the Red Collection, which to me sounded so much more full. It sounded like, this is a silly way to say it, but it sounded like a full band. It sounded like everything was in balance and everything had a really big, nice, fat sound. And a couple of those are Drive My Car, which I thought sounded remarkable on this collection. And Hide Your Love Away was great. We Can Work It Out sounded phenomenal. So, that's one of the things. They sounded like a rock band playing in a club right in front of you. And that's something that I absolutely loved.
I thought, special ones to me were, as I've mentioned, Magical Mystery Tour from Blue, but Red, I was really into She Loves You and I Want to Hold Your Hand. And Can't Buy Me Love because I listened to it 17,000 times to try to listen to that one difference, but I was like that.
Right.
That sounds killer.
I will also say that the first 3 tracks, Love Me Do, Please Please Me, From Me to You, just hit you in the face. They just come across so incredibly strongly. And I thought I was just blown away by the difference.
I agree. The second I put my headphones on, I was like, I just can't believe. And you know what's funny? I was even listening. I was outside all day bird watching, and I just put stuff on my phone just to listen to. And I mean, it's just a stinking iPhone. The sound isn't great, but I could tell even then that it was, because I was going back and forth like you were doing. You were saying you were listening to different versions of it, so I was doing the same thing, even on an iPhone. And you can tell,
And I will say that I have spent more time with the Red Collection because, like you, Steph, I am much more interested in the latter part of the Beatles career. I love the experimentation. I love the psychedelia. I love all of the, not using the word progressive in terms of progressive rock, but they were very progressive in the way that they conceived songs and the way that they composed and everything. And so I really spent a lot more time with the Red Collection because this really made me hear some of that older stuff in a brand new way.
Yeah.
And I really found myself drawn to it much more so.
100% agreed. Yeah, it made me more of a fan of their really early stuff.
Yeah, I think Here Comes the Sun, I think really came out a little more pointed. Hello Goodbye sounded kind of weird to me, just because you kind of hear that sort of weird early phase of a breakbeat almost in it, and it just doesn't, I don't know, it just seemed kind of watery to me.
That's not not a new mix though, is it? Hello Goodbye. That's from,
I can't remember. Yeah.
It's not.
Yellow Submarine sounds fantastic.
Yes, it does.
Which, I've always liked to begin with anyway, but I just
by the way, my grandkids will attest to that, because it was on, I had the grandkids over yesterday when the albums arrived, and we immediately put the Red Album on.
Yeah.
And they actually stopped what they were doing and sang along to Yellow Submarine.
And for me, the stuff on the Red Album is a little more particular, because that's sort of like your gateway drug to the Beatles, right? So you want, that's like, if you screw that up, you screwed the pooch of the whole thing. Right?
Yeah.
The little kids when they're young.
I really did think Sgt. Pepper sounded great. A Day in the Life sounded fantastic. It does a lot of nuanced stuff with Sgt. Pepper, and to a certain extent, Magical Mystery Tour. It does do a little bit of the nuanced stuff with the sessions in and out. And I think, just cleaning up the sound on some of that stuff is fantastic. Get Back sounded great. There's some Paul bassline stuff. I know, Alan, you had mentioned that earlier, but for me, the Paul bassline in Get Back is much clearer. Come Together also is kind of got a little bit of a dirge to it that it's kind of not necessarily there, but right out of the chute, those first 3 tracks are great. Help, I think, is surprisingly really good too. It's a record I've heard a million times, and that version of Help is like, wow, this is fantastic.
Yeah, it is great. I love it.
I didn't think I could hear Help again and have it sound,
exactly.
You're like, I've heard this record like 50,000 times, but how does this sound? This sounds amazing. On Help in particular too, you hear a lot more of Ringo as well. To me, it just sounds like they brought out a lot more of George and Ringo, more than the rest. And I started looking, because I'm that guy, at where placement. I started looking at pictures of the Beatles in the studio. And more often than not, Harrison's on a stool on the side and Ringo's in the back. And their mics are kind of not right on top of it. You can see. Now, there might be other mics, and I'm not a studio guy, so I don't know. But I think with some of these recordings, it kind of made up with some of the deficiencies in the placement of the mics.
I mean, you may be right. I'm pretty sure I remember.
I am overthinking this way more than I should, but yes.
Yeah. I was actually one more downer. There was actually one track I really did not like at all, which was Old Brown Shoe. I did not like the 2023 mix of that.
Interesting.
Someone I read online said the same thing.
I thought it was just a mess, and it completely brought the tone of the album down. Thankfully, it was the last track on that side of the vinyl. So,
right.
We could immediately switch over to Here Comes the Sun and raise the tone, even though that's an older mix. But yes, it was, it just seemed, the thing is, I actually didn't remember it from the album before. So, and I'm sure it was on there, but it just.
The comment that I read about that online said Giles has done a disservice to Old Brown Shoe, totally forgetting to bring up a fader on a guitar line after the words "from worse" and tried to drag me down at 041 into the song. I cannot believe no one caught that. I thought that was really interesting.
That is interesting.
That was in this person's article. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. So
maybe there was a little thing. I mean, look how many Unless you were the people playing those songs and you were there at that time, it's really hard to know. Think about all the tracks and then get them perfectly. I mean, okay, he messed that up, but
I'm talking about one track on 6 albums, 6 albums worth of music. So.
Yeah,
exactly. What I really want with this, and technology is different now. I almost wish they would have criterioned this in that I would almost have gotten a disc with like an audio commentary where they talk about each of the tracks and how they. I would love to.
Would be super interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I would love to hear that.
They're going to do that and surprise us.
Who knows? Maybe there's another Disney Plus documentary in the works.
Yeah.
That would be great.
Oh my God, that would be so great.
Oh my gosh. I would love it. So since we're talking about more of the Blue album right now, let's talk about Now and Then. Mr. Porter, we've talked about this on a previous show, but tell us your thoughts about Now and Then, how it fits into the whole like canon of the Beatles. What do you think this song means to the completion, we'll say, of the Beatles catalog?
I think it's a lovely coda to the Beatles catalog. I'm glad we've got it. It was an amazing journey, a 50-year journey for a piece of art to go from a homemade tape to a beautifully produced song. I'm not a huge fan of the song itself. I think it would have been a middling album track.
Right.
But I think anybody that was expecting them to come out with, another Eleanor Rigby or, whatever was just, manage your expectations.
It's true.
I think I like it more for what it represents than the song itself, if that makes sense.
Agreed.
But I still like it when I hear it. It just doesn't stay with me. So the other morning, my wife and I were driving out to breakfast, and it Now and Then came on Pandora. And we were like, okay, we're humming along with it. We're enjoying it. And then it finishes. And then Fleetwood Mac's The Chain came on.
Mm.
And I'm like, I've pretty much forgotten Now and Then within 2 bars of The Chain starting, which says a lot.
Yeah.
I think I was talking to somebody about this the other night. I think you need to really appreciate it. You need to put it in context. Watch that 12-minute making of video.
I know.
And then, the actual music video came out, and yes, I cried, and it gave me an emotional punch, much more than I was expecting.
Right.
So I think with that supporting material and understanding the context, yes, it's an important song, and I think it's a great coda. Does it stand up as a song on its own? Not that well, to be honest. But I don't think either of the other 2 posthumous releases did either. So
that's exactly what I was going to say. I remember when those first 2, Real Love and Free as a Bird, came out, I was a little underwhelmed with them, because I was hoping that it was not expecting, but I was hoping that it would be another Day in the Life or something like that. But it's not going to be, because this is just a couple of songs that John sat at his kitchen table and wrote, sat at the piano and worked out an arrangement. It's not going to be one of those, big Beatles songs. It's just a John song that
I felt
retroactively turned into a Beatles song.
Well, I felt this was more of a Beatles song than
I think
Free
so
as
too.
a Bird. Free as a Bird was like little sketches that John did, and the others like, oh, what bit's missing? We'll plug bits in, and it felt very disjointed.
Yeah.
At least this one feels like a complete song, and it's sort of more of a White Album song where somebody'd have a song and the others would come in and help them complete it, and sort of Paul would be in very, the 4 of them would probably never be in the studio together on it. They'd wander in and out and stuff. Mm-hmm. It sort of felt like that sort of period. Sort of like a White Album song to me. So I think this is a CD versus vinyl thing.
Yeah.
But I love the albums. I love the fact I got the vinyls. What I don't understand is they had the chance to completely reorder these like they did on the CD.
Yes.
So the whole point, as Rob mentioned earlier, is these were chronological.
Yes.
But what they've actually done is just recreated the 2 albums, and then the
third
album. The extra album, they just put stuff on. And the Blue album is the worst because the first track on it is Now and Then.
Oh, really?
Oh, I hadn't noticed that. Oh, that's interesting.
Instead of it being the last one. So you go from 1970 to 2023 and then back to Blackbird. And it's like, that's terrible.
So
and like the Red Album, I wish they'd taken those cover versions and put them up front.
Right.
You've got the chance to completely repress and reorganize these things. That you didn't need to make them exact duplicates of the 1973 releases.
And I wonder why they did that too, because it's not like they're doing just another pressing of the original record.
Exactly.
Because these are completely new mixes.
Yeah, they could have put them in any order they wanted.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm very pleased that the CD, and when I first bought the CDs, I didn't even know that the LPs were not ordered chronologically.
Yeah.
And I'm so glad that the CDs are, because I would not be happy with this if they were not that way.
Yeah, well, I love the vinyl, but that just bugs the hell out of me. So.
I don't blame you. All right, we're going to take a quick break. We will be back in 30 seconds to wrap up our show. Stick around. We'll see you then.
Hey, Joe.
Hey, Tony.
Do you like ads about podcasts?
You know it.
How about ads about Doctor Who podcasts?
Even better.
Well, you're in luck, because this is an ad about a Doctor Who podcast.
Wow, I love it.
And you'll love us, the Watchathon of Rassilon, a podcast about Doctor Who.
I'll buy 12.
Actually, it's free.
I'll buy 13 then.
All right, so that's it. I think that's our last Beatles episode for this year. We've got another one planned for January. So thank you, Mr. Porter, for joining us for this discussion. I really enjoyed having you part with us.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. And just because I just ended on a downer before the break, by the way, I really do love these albums. They will be getting my wife will be so fed up of them by the end of the week, because they will be getting multiple re-listens.
Right.
But so this has been an exceptional Beatles weekend, and I look forward to giving these wonderful remixes and multiple listens going forward.
So tell people where they can find more about you, and if they want to look into your book or your podcast, tell people where they can find more information.
So for me, generally, you can find me at my website, alanjporter.com. But for the Beatles stuff, if you're on Twitter, we have at Before Beatles. And as I mentioned earlier, we have the monthly newsletter, beforebeatles.substack.com. And the podcast, I'm going to give you the old URL because it's a lot easier than the new one. It's anchor.fm/Before Beatles. And now it's owned by Spotify. That URL is ridiculously long.
It is terrible.
But it will but the anchor.fm one will get you there. Or you can just find us on any of your favorite podcasting platforms. And actually, most of our listeners come to us via Spotify. So we're all over Spotify. Just search Before They Were Beatles and you will find us.
All right, Rob, where can people find you and your lovely voice?
Well, my dulcet tones can be found in several places. On the Weekend Justice podcast for needcoffee.com. Also on Louder Than War Radio on the internets every Monday from 6 to 8 Greenwich Mean Time, which I believe I have to sort out the daylight savings time in England because I'm American and we're dumb. But that's 12 to 2 Central, 1 to 3 Eastern. And then, so all of that is archived on Mixcloud. You can hear all 35 editions of the show on Mixcloud, as well as the new one if you miss it on Monday. And then Wednesdays, I'm still at it on KDHX in St. Louis. So you can listen to that Wednesdays from 7 to 9 Central Time. Or if you're out and about, maybe you got to pick up a prescription, or maybe you've got a spitting cobra you have to get out of your house. You can listen to it on the archive stream at kdhx.org for 2 weeks. Each show is archived for 2 weeks.
Spitting cobra. That's a new one.
Stephanie,
yes.
There are people. The people are desperate
to
know more about you. They're desperate to connect with you. How would they do so?
Well, you can find me on Facebook at Stephanie Seymour Music. You can find me on Instagram at there_r_birds. And I also have a website, therearebirds.com. And you can find me on all the streaming platforms like Spotify and all that. And on Bandcamp too, under my name.
Right on. I've got a lovely little website called cosmiccreative.com, KOZMIC creative.com. And that's got a bunch of books that I've written and a couple of books that I've published by other people and the podcasts that I do. So go check that out. We will be back next week. Actually, I think next week it's just me and Anthony.
I think
right?
it is.
You two are off gallivanting around the globe. Anthony and I are going to be here, and we're going to be talking about the recently published Rolling Stone list of the 250 best guitarists. And let me tell you, we both have things to say about this list. So join us for that. Everybody take care. Have a great week, and we'll see you next time.
This has been a broadcast of the ESO Network. Be part of the crew and help support our shows by donating to our ESO Patreon or by shopping for the TeePublic store, which can all be found at www.esonetwork.com. The ESO Network, your station for all things geek.